A foggy dawn had barely touched the streets of London when a train vanished without a trace, its disappearance tangled in a web of political secrets and unspeakable betrayal. A diplomat's life, extinguished in the shadows, and a conspiracy lurking behind every whispered word. What remains when truth itself is buried under empire's weight? The clock is ticking, and the game is far from over. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's get started. It was on a grey and muffled morning in the late November of 1892 that I found myself once again ensconced by the hearth of our familiar sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The fog, thick as muslin and heavy with coal smoke, pressed insistently against the window panes, rendering the world outside a blurred and soundless spectre. Even the clatter of the hansoms in the street below seemed subdued, as though London herself were holding her breath. Holmes, wrapped in his dressing gown and seated cross-legged upon the settee, had not yet spoken a word. His eyes, half-lidded, were fixed not upon me nor the paper in his lap, but upon some distant place beyond either wall or hour. It was in such silences that I had come to know my friend best. Not in the moments of triumph when the criminal lay unmasked at his feet, but in the still hours where his mind turned inward, weaving threads I could neither see nor fathom. The peace, however, was not to endure. There came a knock at the door, a crisp, official sort of knock, and Mrs. Hudson shortly entered with a visiting card delicately pinched between her fingers. Holmes did not stir. "Mr. Selim Dervish," I read aloud, "attaché to the Turkish embassy." "Show him in," Holmes said without so much as a glance. The gentleman who entered was slight of frame and impeccably dressed, with eyes like polished jet and a moustache carved with surgical precision. His gloves bore flecks of damp earth, and as he seated himself, I noted a faint, acrid aroma that lingered about his person. "I trust your journey from Dover was uneventful," Holmes said, fixing his guest with that hawk-like gaze so often mistaken for indifference. Mr. Dervish started. I arrived scarcely an hour ago." "You were informed?" "Not at all," Holmes replied. "But the soil on your heel is of the silty reddish kind found near Calais. The mud of Dover, by contrast, clings in clumps and is chalk-based. Further, the remnants of Latakia tobacco upon your sleeve are unique to the ports of the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically Constantinople." The attaché looked utterly confounded. "I believe you bring with you a matter of state," Holmes added mildly. "One best spoken of with fewer ears in the hallway." Mr. Dervish had scarcely departed when Mrs. Hudson reappeared, this time bearing a telegram upon a small silver tray. Holmes opened it with a flick of his pale fingers and read it silently, his brow tightening only by the faintest degree. Then, without a word, he handed it to me. "Urgent. Foreign Office requests your immediate attention. Diplomatic train to Istanbul vanished without trace. Matter extremely sensitive. Awaiting you, Whitehall." I looked up in disbelief. "A vanished train, Holmes? Surely that is a theatrical turn of phrase." "I fear not," he replied, already rising to retrieve his coat and boots. "The Foreign Office is not in the habit of exaggeration when it comes to matters of national security. But a train cannot simply disappear." "Cannot it?" Holmes said with a faint smile. "And yet we live in a world where men vanish beneath the very eyes of the City Watch. Come, Watson, the game may not yet be afoot, but the timetable, it seems, has gone missing." As we rode through the thickening fog toward Whitehall, I found my thoughts drifting uneasily toward the contents of that cryptic telegram. A train, secret in purpose and diplomatic in nature, had departed from Dover with its cargo of envoys, correspondence, and national interest, and somewhere between the cliffs of Kent and the banks of the Bosphorus, it had simply ceased to exist. No derailment had been reported, no wreckage found, no passengers accounted for. It was as though the carriages had been swallowed whole by the continent. Even Holmes, who had seen miracles wrought from mud, ink, and ash, had grown quiet. There was something in his manner, not alarm but a sharpened attentiveness, that told me this case would demand the full measure of his mind. And perhaps I could not help but feel something more. We had scarcely returned from Whitehall when our doorbell rang a second time that morning, its sharp peal cutting through the residual hush of fog that lingered even within the flat. Mrs. Hudson showed in a man of upright carriage whose attire bore the stamp of bureaucratic neatness, though his gloved hands twitched with an involuntary haste that betrayed his composure. "Sir Reginald Pendray," Holmes murmured, greeting him with no small measure of familiarity. "The Foreign Office sends its deepest anxiety, I presume." Sir Reginald gave a curt nod and sat stiffly upon the edge of the armchair nearest the fire. He was not an old man, but the pallor of his skin and the weariness beneath his eyes bespoke burdens of a diplomatic sort, those that weigh heavier in silence than in speech. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "what I am about to disclose must remain strictly between us three. I have not come here as a matter of curiosity or professional indulgence, but of state." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "Then let us treat the matter with the discretion it requires." The air in the room seemed to contract around us. Sir Reginald took a slow breath, as though to prepare not only his lungs, but his conscience. "5 days ago," he said, "a diplomatic envoy departed London under full secrecy. He carried sensitive communiques, sealed under ministerial warrant, destined for the British consulate in Constantinople. These documents pertain to an ongoing treaty revision, and, more critically, the exposure of an internal threat." "Internal?" Holmes asked mildly. "The possibility of treason," Pendray said, lowering his voice, "the sort that could topple not only reputations, but alliances." The weight of such a statement did not escape me, and yet what followed was more incredible still. The envoy, along with his guard, boarded a private train from Dover, a train not listed on any public schedule, not marked in the station logbooks, and dispatched under the code name Vesica. It crossed the Channel without incident. We confirmed its passage into Calais. After that, nothing. "Nothing," I echoed, unable to hide my astonishment. "It was meant to pass, without interruption, through France, into Austria-Hungary, then through Bulgaria, and onto the Ottoman border, but no station master along the route has reported its arrival. No signal post has acknowledged its passage. It is as though the train vanished into mist." Holmes remained quite still. "Vanished," Sir Reginald repeated. "Entirely." Holmes rose and moved toward the fireplace, his eyes not on the embers, but on something inward, calculating and abstract. "A diplomatic train, known only to a handful of officials, disappears mid-continent without report or trace," he said. "And yet, trains do not disappear. They may be diverted, delayed, or destroyed, but never made to evaporate. That would require either the work of a magician or a conspirator." Pendray's lips tightened. "We have considered sabotage, but the route is secure. The documents were escorted under diplomatic seal. No foreign agents were believed to have been aware of its departure." "Precisely why its disappearance must trouble you," Holmes said. "If an enemy state had no knowledge of the envoy's travel, then how could they intercept a train that officially did not exist?" The silence that followed was affirmation enough. I looked to Sir Reginald and saw, for the first time, the unmistakable presence of fear. Not the fear of personal ruin, but the larger, colder fear that comes when the machinery of empire begins to slip from its rails. Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "Someone new," he said quietly. and they were not meant to. As the door closed behind Sir Reginald, I found myself pacing the rug before the hearth, my thoughts weighed by implications I could barely begin to articulate. The idea that an entire train, men, documents, steel and wood, could vanish across a continent, and that such a thing might be the result of treachery from within our own ranks, struck at the very spine of my national faith. Holmes, meanwhile, had returned to his chair, his gaze alight with that singular intensity I had come to recognize in him, the gleam of the mind fully engaged. "You seem unusually stirred, Holmes," I remarked, hoping to conceal my own unease. "Do I?" he replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I find the case elegant." "Elegant?" I repeated. "A diplomatic train disappears without a trace. No witnesses, no timetable, no wreckage, no ransom. It is not merely a question of how, Watson. It is a question of who benefits and who fears discovery most." He leaned back and closed his eyes, murmuring almost to himself, "A train cannot disappear. It must be found." And with that quiet utterance, the case had begun. Our departure from London was neither announced nor marked by the usual bustle that attends our journeys. Holmes, ever wary of unseen ears and political entanglements, had secured for us a discreet passage to Paris under assumed names. Mine as a fictitious Dr. Penworth, travelling for a medical symposium, and Holmes as Mr. Adrian Vernet, a quiet antiquarian with an interest in Balkan pottery. Our luggage was sparse and unlabelled, our papers forged with such exacting precision that not even a customs official would think to question them. As we crossed the Channel, Holmes remained characteristically silent, though I noted he kept a folded map of Central Europe tucked into his coat pocket, which he consulted often with narrowed eyes. He smoked less than usual and spoke not at all during the journey to Gare du Nord, where we passed unnoticed into the crowded arteries of Paris. "There are eyes in Paris," he said quietly as we disembarked. "Eyes not aligned with any flag. We must tread lightly." From there, we began to trace the vanished train's intended path, a course that, if followed, would lead us not only across borders, but into shadowed territories of motive, betrayal, and silence. Our inquiries began in earnest at Calais, where the ill-fated diplomatic train had emerged after crossing from Dover. The officials there, though perplexed by our questions, produced entry records affirming the arrival of a private train under the name Vesica, consistent with Sir Reginald's description. Yet something in their manner was evasive, their answers clipped, as though rehearsed. Holmes, with his usual disarming courtesy, engaged a junior telegraph clerk over lunch and procured a list of outbound signals, timings, frequencies, and destinations. By comparing these with records at the adjacent stations in Amiens and Reims, he discovered an incongruity. Vesica had been listed as a freight carrier, devoid of any passenger annotation. "It is one thing to travel in secrecy," Holmes muttered, "and quite another to travel in disguise." From Reims to Strasbourg, the trail grew faint. No engineer recalled seeing the distinctive lacquered carriages Holmes had described, and one station master hesitated before confessing that the routing code matched that of a timber shipment bound for Trieste. Holmes requested the freight manifest and found it had been tampered with. A falsified list of cargo, wood, saltpeter, and slate contained typographical inconsistencies Holmes identified immediately. The signature at the bottom, ostensibly from the British consular office, was forged. "The train passed here," Holmes declared, tapping the margin, "but it was never meant to be known as what it truly was." And with that, the journey pressed eastward into lands where fewer spoke English, but many concealed truth beneath civility. We reached Plovdiv by a rattling provincial line that wound through cold hills and railway yards strewn with discarded iron. The signal station there was modest. Its lone operator, a leathery man named Iliev, greeted us with the wary suspicion of one who has seen too much and spoken too little. Holmes introduced us as historians of rail commerce, a guise under which we gained access to the signal logs of the week in question. For hours we sat in that dim chamber, Holmes meticulously comparing the telegraph entries against his private time chart. The discrepancy revealed itself just past midnight on the second day. An outgoing message had been recorded in ink, but not transmitted, according to the timing coil. "This message," Holmes said to Iliev, tapping the book, "was never sent." Iliev's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. I noticed a nervous glance toward the filing shelf, and Holmes followed it. There, beneath a loose floorboard, he pried up with the blade of his knife. We discovered a bundle of unsent messages, deliberately withheld. Among them was an unsigned note, stamped with the code used by Vesica. Iliev confessed reluctantly that 2 men in uniform had come 3 days prior to our arrival, warning him not to speak of anything unusual that had passed his post. "They did not show badges," he said, "but they carried London voices." Holmes nodded grimly. "Then it is not a foreign thief we pursue, but a domestic ghost." Beyond the station at Sliven, we took to foot, following a faint, disused track Holmes had located on a pre-war Austrian map. The air was thin and dry, the terrain grown wild with nettles and brambles. Our boots stirred the silence of the Balkan forest, and I could not help but feel we were treading the borders of something long buried. At length, we reached a decaying rail spur that vanished into a gnarled ravine. Holmes knelt beside one of the rusted rails and withdrew a lens from his breast pocket. "Note the soil," he murmured. "This has been disturbed within the fortnight." He ran a gloved hand along a warped iron bracket and revealed a fresh scratch, metal upon metal, not yet dulled by weather. The tunnel mouth itself had been partially boarded, though not securely. Holmes removed a plank and peered inside. A faint echo answered. He retrieved a lantern from his satchel and ventured in. I followed, my nerves taut as violin string. Within, the walls were scarred by recent wheel tracks. A side chamber, once used for loading ore, now held signs of occupation, crushed cigarette ends, a torn bit of velvet upholstery, and in the corner, a splinter of lacquered wood with English lettering. "Part of a carriage panel," Holmes confirmed. "The train was diverted here and hidden." "But why here?" I asked. "To delay," Holmes answered, eyes narrowed. "Or to dispose." Our descent from the ravine led us to a village that did not appear on any of our maps. Little more than a handful of stone dwellings clinging to the foot of the Carpathians. The residents eyed us with the suspicion reserved for outsiders and emissaries of cities far removed from their world. We took lodging at a modest tavern, and word of our presence spread with the velocity of smoke. That evening, as Holmes busied himself examining the fragment of panel we had recovered, I sat by the fire, listening to the murmurs of old men in the corner. It was then that a child entered, barefoot, his clothes threadbare, his eyes wide and silent. He said nothing, but approached Holmes directly and held out his hand. In his palm was a small object, wrapped in cloth. Holmes accepted it with grave gentleness and unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay a scarf, dark red, almost black in places, with a gold thread running its border. A diplomatic crest had been stitched into one corner. The boy said nothing. Holmes knelt before him. "Who gave this to you?" he asked softly. The child pointed eastward, toward the mountains. Holmes looked to me. "This scarf did not blow here on the wind, Watson. Someone died to deliver it." Holmes held the scarf with deliberate care, his gloved fingers turning its folds with the tenderness one might afford a wounded creature. The blood upon it had dried to a dark crust, but its quantity left little doubt. The wearer had not survived long beyond its staining. He examined the stitching beneath the crest, and I watched the lines around his eyes deepen. This was standard issue. he said at last. Worn only by upper-level diplomatic couriers. Whoever wore it was likely the envoy himself. But why deliver it here? I asked, my voice scarcely above a whisper. To ensure it was found, Holmes replied, before the rest was buried. For a long moment, he did not move. The child stood still, awaiting something. But Holmes said no more. He folded the scarf with great care and returned it to the cloth in which it had arrived. That night, Holmes said little. His silence was not that of contemplation, but of something colder, an inward tightening, as though he were already bracing for a truth he had glimpsed and wished he had not. The case had grown darker, and Holmes, though outwardly unchanged, had begun to carry its shadow. The days that followed our descent from the Carpathians were marked by a deepening sense of unease. The train line, once a thread of steel linking empires, now felt more like a noose. Holmes, though composed, grew more taciturn, and I had come to recognize that such silences in him bespoke danger, real and near. It was in Varna, a port city hemmed by the Black Sea, that the first overt warning arrived. We had returned to our lodging after a day spent reviewing outdated customs records when Holmes discovered a folded slip of paper wedged beneath the door of our suite. There was no wax, no seal, only coarse paper, folded once, with no sign of handwriting on the outside. He opened it slowly. The note within bore a single line in careful block script. Turn back now, or join the vanished. Holmes studied it with narrowed eyes, then handed it to me without a word. There are moments, he said quietly, when the voice of threat adopts the manner of courtesy. You believe it credible? I asked, trying to mask my concern. I believe, he replied, that someone is watching who very much wishes we were not. He tucked the note into his coat and resumed his study of the maps. More slowly now, more carefully. It was not long before I, too, sensed a presence that had begun to move when we moved, stop when we paused, and vanish when confronted. A man of ordinary stature, clad in a worn travelling coat with a distinctive crimson hat that caught the eye, even in the busiest platform. I first noticed him at the Varna post, again at Burgas, and then, quite unmistakably, boarding the same southbound train we had planned to take on Holmes's revised timetable. When I pointed him out, Holmes merely nodded, as though confirming a suspicion he had long harboured. He is not following us, Holmes remarked, lighting his pipe with uncharacteristic calm. He is meant to be seen. You believe he is a decoy? A rather poor one, Holmes replied. He draws the eye intentionally, leaving another, subtler pair of eyes to observe from the periphery. I glanced about the compartment with fresh discomfort, now wondering which of our fellow passengers might be the true shadow. I must thank him, Holmes added with the faintest trace of irony. He has saved us the effort of guessing whether our presence is noted. The train whistled, and the crimson hat disappeared once more into the crowd. The next night, we lodged at a modest inn near the town of Lüleburgaz, where the old track bent inland through hills that smelled of pine and ash. Holmes seemed restless throughout the evening, his fingers tapping the table in rhythmic intervals, as though listening for a pulse beneath the surface of the town. We shared a sparse supper and retired early. Yet when I rose with the dawn, Holmes's bed was undisturbed, untouched. His boots were gone, as was his travelling coat, and the lock on our door bore no sign of forced entry. My first instinct was to assume a nocturnal inquiry, one of those peculiar ventures Holmes was wont to conduct when something piqued his deeper curiosity. But as the hours wore on, and no word came, my mind turned swiftly to darker possibilities. I questioned the innkeeper, the stable boy, the porters. None had seen a man matching Holmes's description. By noon, I had become convinced that something had happened. I wandered the cobbled streets, haunted by the echo of Holmes's voice and the warning note we had received. The mere thought of his absence struck like a blow to the ribs. When dusk returned, and with it no sign of my friend, I feared the very worst. It was just past dawn when the door creaked open and Holmes stepped inside, his boots muddied, his collar damp with sea spray, and the unmistakable scent of smoke clinging to his coat. I leapt from my chair in both relief and indignation. "Holmes, for heaven's sake, where have you been?" He raised a hand and removed a thin envelope from his inner pocket. "I trust you kept your nerve intact, Watson," he said, offering me a seat. "I had an engagement of some delicacy which required solitude and a certain persuasive coinage." I sat down as he poured tea with his usual deliberation. "I found them in the southern docks, smugglers, 2 of whom had passed through the ravine where our train was hidden. With the correct price and a hint of shared enmity toward government formalities, they spoke." He drew out a torn page from a freight ledger. On it was the name of a small private freight concern and a recent entry. "Unmarked cargo car, reassigned to Ottoman Line, Istanbul bound." "They offloaded the train's rear compartment," he said, "reattached it under a false identity. A ghost car now headed for the city." "Then the envoy?" "If alive," Holmes said darkly, "he is bound for a place where voices go to die." We sat long into that day, the shutters drawn, the murmur of the inn far removed from the weight of Holmes's revelations. He unfolded one by one the threads he had been tracing since Plovdiv, not toward theft nor foreign interference, but toward something colder and infinitely more perilous. "The envoy," Holmes began, "was not merely carrying diplomatic summaries or trade drafts. That would not merit this level of erasure. No, he carried letters, copies of correspondence implicating a senior member of our own Foreign Office in the sale of confidential intelligence to the Ottoman court." I felt my throat tighten. "Treason?" "Of the most methodical kind," Holmes replied, "and yet not without motive. The man in question, whom I shall not name until the final piece is placed, was once stationed in Anatolia. He cultivated ties, some legitimate, others profitable." "And the envoy uncovered it?" "He did more," Holmes said. "He intended to expose it, quietly but firmly. The letters were addressed to the Home Office, yet were never to pass through London. The train was his fortress. Instead, it became his tomb." He met my gaze. "This is no robbery, Watson. This is suppression." Outside, a church bell tolled, a sound as old as betrayal. We arrived in Constantinople, known to most as Istanbul, at the stroke of dusk, the city alight with oil lanterns and mystery. Though Holmes had travelled under the name of Professor Werner Klein and I as his assistant, the disguises were more practical than elaborate, for in a city so dense with trade and treachery, a false identity is no more questioned than a stranger's shadow. Our steamer had crept along the Bosphorus under a waning moon, and as we disembarked amidst porters and officials, Holmes made a pointed remark. "This is the city where truth is stored in lockboxes, and silence is sold by the ounce." The streets bustled with every imaginable dialect, from clipped German to languid Arabic, and yet amid the swirl of tongues and tobacco, we moved without interference. Holmes had arranged lodging in Galata under the pretense of archaeological research, a cover that attracted little scrutiny in a city riddled with antiquity. That night, over coffee thick as ink, Holmes unfurled a rough sketch of the Serkici rail yards. "Somewhere in these bones lies the missing carriage," he said, tapping the parchment. "If we find it, we find the body. And with the body, the bullet. And with the bullet," I thought, "perhaps the face of the hand that fired it." By morning, Holmes had secured the guidance of a certain Mahir, a former station porter turned fixer, who, for the right fee, could navigate both rail lines and bureaucratic back doors with equal ease. We met him at the edge of a disused freight yard near Yedikule, where the old lines twisted toward the sea like neglected arteries. The place reeked of brine and rust. Iron rails lay half-submerged in stagnant pools, and freight cars, forgotten by time and ledger alike, stood rotting like mausoleums. Maher led us to the far end of the yard, where a carriage rested on a sunken track, its wheels nearly engulfed by water, its livery scrubbed of all markings. Holmes examined the latch. Sealed, but not locked, he muttered. He produced a slender implement and slid the bolt aside with deft silence. As he drew open the door, a smell like sodden upholstery and extinguished fire wafted out. Inside, the carriage was bare save for an iron trunk and the shattered remnants of a writing desk. Holmes stepped in, careful not to disturb the floorboards, and withdrew a scorched fragment of paper from beneath the bench. Its wax seal was melted but unmistakably British. No manifest, no log, no signature, he said softly. This car was not meant to be found, Watson. It was meant to be forgotten. And then his eyes moved to the shadows at the far end. There, he whispered. Bring your lantern. The beam from my lantern fell upon what had once been a man of considerable stature, now reduced to the stillness of indignity. The envoy, though his name was never given to us, lay crumpled against the far wall of the compartment. His suit, once clearly of fine tailoring, was darkened with blood at the temple. A single bullet wound, neat and final, marked the spot where life had been extinguished. Holmes knelt beside the body and examined the hands. No struggle, he observed. No defensive wounds. This was not an attack. It was an execution. Beside the corpse lay a satchel, half burned. Within it, the remnants of what had once been official papers, diplomatic in nature, judging by the partially legible stamps. Holmes lifted one ash-fringed scrap and held it to the lantern's light. Third dispatch, revision of Coastal Fleet. He let the fragment fall. Someone took time to destroy this, not hastily, but selectively. I felt a wave of nausea, not at the sight of death, but at the cold deliberation it implied. Whoever had done this had planned it meticulously, and left no trace of themselves behind. Holmes stood slowly. They gave him no trial, no witness, only silence. And then, as though addressing the stillness, but silence can be made to speak, if one listens correctly. Later that afternoon, we made our way to the British Embassy, a pale edifice set upon a hill, its flag limp in the coastal wind. Holmes requested a private audience with the acting liaison, a Mr. Charles Etheridge, a man of crisp waistcoat and thinning hair, whose handshake trembled slightly when offered. Holmes wasted no time with pleasantries. He presented the scorched seal, recovered from the carriage, and fixed his gaze upon the man's paling features. "Do you deny having knowledge of Vaesica's dispatch?" Holmes asked. I was informed of its route only after its departure," Etheridge stammered. "Everything above my grade. Surely you understand." "Quite," Holmes said coldly. "But tell me, was Colonel Woodley ever assigned to this embassy?" The man faltered. "Colonel Woodley? He returned to London last year." "Did he?" Holmes leaned forward. "Or did he remain here in shadow, awaiting the man who knew too much?" Etheridge opened his mouth, then closed it again. Holmes rose. "You are not the traitor, Mr. Etheridge, but you know who is, and that makes you something else." The man said nothing more, but I noted that his pen hand continued to tremble. Back in our lodging, Holmes paced the narrow quarters with a restlessness that rarely overtook him, his thoughts coalescing like storm clouds before a strike. He stopped at the window and spoke with quiet finality. "It was not the Ottomans," he said, "nor anarchists, nor smugglers. The enemy lies within. You believe the envoy uncovered proof of treason? I asked. I am certain of it. Colonel Sebastian Woodley, decorated, beloved, but as morally bankrupt as any swindler in the alleys of Spitalfields, sold secrets to the port during his last assignment. The envoy had letters, names, enough to bring down not only Woodley, but any man who shielded him. I sat, reeling. And the Foreign Office? Complicit, Holmes said. Perhaps not in the murder itself, but certainly in the suppression. The train was erased, the car abandoned, the envoy silenced. He retrieved the bloodied scarf once more, the one from the mute child, and placed it beside the scorched seal from the satchel. Truth burns, he murmured, but it also smoulders, and the scent of it cannot be hidden forever. In that moment, I felt the grim clarity of Holmes's resolve. This was no longer about solving a case. It was about ensuring that justice, however veiled by diplomacy, was not wholly denied. We returned to London beneath a curtain of grey skies and silence, the very atmosphere seeming to echo the burdensome revelations gathered from across the continent. Holmes had said little during the voyage. In truth, he scarcely spoke a word from the moment we left the crumbling freight yard in Istanbul to the hour we stepped again onto the fog-soaked platform at Victoria Station. Our return was deliberately unannounced. No telegram preceded us, and Holmes took great care to avoid the usual routes known to even his most intimate of contacts. There was no cab summoned outside the station. Instead, we walked the final mile to Baker Street, our collars turned up against the drizzle that seemed to thicken into a weight rather than fall as rain. I confess I longed for the comforts of our hearth and the familiar clutter of our sitting room, but I sensed instinctively that Holmes's mind was elsewhere, beyond the lamplit streets of London and buried deep within the folds of official secrecy and betrayal. "It is not the scandal, Watson," he murmured as we turned onto Baker Street. "It is the scale. The machinery of silence must be vast indeed, to swallow a train whole." And with that, we stepped again into the place where so many of our strangest adventures had begun. Yet this, I feared, would end not in justice, but in compromise. By the second morning after our return, Holmes's energy had resumed its typical, almost unnerving focus. Having slept scarcely 3 hours, he began dictating to me a series of notes, ostensibly from a fabricated department within the Colonial Audit Office. The notes referenced a confidential review of diplomatic expenses, flagged irregular transfers of funds during Woodley's Anatolian service, and hinted at a forthcoming tribunal. None of it was true, of course, but the point was not truth, it was bait. "These must reach 2 men in particular," Holmes said, handing me envelopes already addressed. "One is Geoffrey Hayworth, Under-Secretary and an honest fool. The other, Mr. Felix Carton, is precisely the opposite." "And how shall we ensure they speak of them?" I asked. "They will not need encouragement," Holmes replied. "Rumour in Whitehall is not a ripple, it is a tide. One whisper is sufficient to stir a flood." By midday, the missives had found their way into precisely the corridors Holmes intended, and by dusk I witnessed the first signs of the machinery creaking into motion. A clerk I knew from the Treasury passed me on the Strand and paused long enough to say, "Word is Colonel Woodley may soon be reviewed. Old accounts from Smyrna. Curious timing, eh?" Holmes, upon hearing this, gave a rare smile. "The fox hears the hounds long before the horn sounds," he said. "We shall now wait and see which hole he bolts to." That very evening, as the first snow of December began to settle upon the rooftops of Marylebone, Holmes received word via a trusted informer that a certain retired telegraph clerk in Wapping, Mr. Elias Hodder, had reported signs of a tampered lock and footprints in the alley behind his meagre dwelling. Hodder had served for 30 years with the South Eastern Railways and, more importantly, had been stationed at the obscure Bulgarian signal post, whose falsified logs Holmes had so astutely uncovered. "He knows something," Holmes remarked, drawing on his pipe. "Or someone believes he does. In either case, tonight shall give us more than frostbite." We travelled at once to Wapping, arriving just past 10. The clerk's lodgings were modest, dimly lit, and heavy with the scent of old paper and tobacco. Mr. Hodder himself, a stooped man with watery eyes and a mild stammer, was visibly shaken, but consented to Holmes's request that we lie in wait within his parlour. So we extinguished the lamp, left the door unlatched, and sat in silence. Holmes behind the curtained bay window, I by the far stair. 2 hours passed, then a soft creak. A shadow moved across the threshold. Holmes's hand was already outstretched, his voice a low command. "Step forward, quietly." The man who stepped into the room froze at the sound of Holmes's voice. For a brief instant I glimpsed only a tall figure in an overcoat, face obscured by a scarf and the brim of a traveller's hat. Then Holmes moved swiftly, grasping the man's wrist and turning it behind his back with practiced precision. The hat fell to the floor. Even in the dim light I knew the face. "Pendray," I breathed. "Sir Reginald Pendray." The man said nothing. He made no attempt to protest nor even struggle. Holmes released him slowly, and the Foreign Office official, our very client from what seemed now a distant foggy morning, sank into the clerk's armchair like a man sentenced without trial. He was pale. His eyes darted not in fear, but in calculation. He knew he had been followed into a trap of his own making. "You have been a poor actor, Pendray," Holmes said coolly, "and an even poorer conspirator." "What proof have you?" Pendray rasped, the mask of bureaucratic detachment gone. "Enough," Holmes replied, "to ensure you do not vanish like your envoy." Pendray said nothing further, but I saw the sweat gather at his brow, despite the bitter cold. Holmes gestured to me. "Fetch Inspector Hopkins, and tell him," he added, with a note of grim satisfaction, "that he need not be delicate." By noon the next day, Holmes stood before a quiet tribunal, an arrangement more administrative than judicial, though no less grave for its formality. Present were 2 senior officials from the Home Office, a barrister of impeccable neutrality, and the ever-watchful Inspector Hopkins, now convinced that what began as a missing train had led to the darkest corridors of power. Holmes spoke without passion or flourish. He placed on the table the blood-stained scarf, its insignia unmistakable, the same retrieved from the mute child in the Carpathians. "Recovered less than 15 miles from the false tunnel near Plovdiv," he said, a warning unheeded, or perhaps a cry for justice unheard. Next, he produced the falsified telegraph logs, the same Holt clerk had signed under duress, likely threatened by those tasked with burying the train's path. Then came the tunnel records, the permit for rerouting the final rail car, signed by an alias Holmes had already traced to a dormant Foreign Office account. Finally, Holmes withdrew the last item, a creased envelope slightly singed at the edges but legible. "This," he said, "was found within the lining of the envoy's valise, preserved by accident or design." He opened the letter, and in a voice quiet but clear, read the closing lines. "Should anything befall me, let it be known that the hands guiding this treason belong not to enemies abroad, but to Pendray of the Foreign Office, who believes his country must be spared the scandal more than served the truth." Pendray, seated silently throughout, did not deny the charge. He only said, "I did what was necessary to avoid war." Holmes replied without flinching, "And in doing so, you declared war upon the truth." It was on a raw and windswept morning that Holmes and I were conveyed, without ceremony and without escort, to a chamber deep within the recesses of Whitehall. The air inside was close with old dust. and the faintest hint of sealing wax. An airless, soundless space, more accustomed, I suspected, to secrets than to sunlight. 4 men sat already at the long table, 3 in sombre civilian dress, 1 in the quiet uniform of a naval intelligence division. They did not introduce themselves, and Holmes did not request it. Such was the nature of this affair, nameless, quiet, and deeply wreathed in institutional discretion. Sir Reginald Pendray was brought in not 5 minutes after us, his eyes hollow, his gait burdened by the knowledge that his fate was to be settled not by jury or ink, but by the gravity of his own confession and the weight of Holmes's logic. A clerk stood by the door with no pen or paper. There would be no record, no ledger, no history. Holmes, standing with his back to the curtained window, waited until the room had stilled to its most unbearable quiet. Then, with a calm that bespoke neither anger nor triumph, he began to speak. "Gentlemen, you asked for the truth. I shall now deliver it, as plainly as a train vanishes when those sworn to protect it decide instead to conceal it." Holmes's recitation of the facts was not theatrical, yet it possessed a quiet force that made every man present lean forward in reluctant anticipation. He began with the forged telegraph transmissions at the Plovdiv junction, dispatches which, though entered into the official log, had never been sent. The clerk responsible, Elias Hodder, had since retired, but Holmes produced a signed statement detailing the pressure brought to bear upon him by unnamed superiors. He then turned to the falsified routing documents, retrieved from the Ottoman Rail Ministry under a different alias, one linked through handwriting and bank accounts to an office under Pendray's purview. These documents, Holmes explained, allowed a final car to detach at a false junction and vanish into the flooded yard outside Istanbul. The scarf came next, still blood-stained, bearing the insignia of the British Embassy and retrieved from the frightened hands of a mute child in the Balkan foothills. Holmes placed it gently on the table, its presence more eloquent than any testimony. "And lastly," he said, producing a folded page from within his inner coat, "the envoy's final insurance." He read aloud the letter we had discovered within the lining of the envoy's valise, written in haste but with clarity. It named Pendray directly and outlined the motives behind his complicity, the silencing of a man who had unearthed inconvenient truths. No one interrupted Holmes. The silence that followed was not the stillness of uncertainty, but of weight, of undeniable reality settling upon shoulders not designed to bear its moral freight. Sir Reginald stared at the scarf, as though it were a ghost returned to accuse him. At length, Sir Reginald rose from his chair. He did not plead, nor did he deny the claims. Rather, he spoke with the strained composure of a man who had convinced himself, perhaps for years, that the crime he committed had been, in some remote and abstract sense, necessary. "What I did," he said, "I did for the safety of the Empire. We are on the edge of chaos, gentlemen. Foreign spies lurk in every corridor of Europe, and alliances falter on the breath of rumour. Had that letter reached the wrong eyes, it might have cost us not merely prestige, but lives." He gestured toward Holmes without rancour. "I do not question the detective's thoroughness. Indeed, I knew when I engaged him that he might come to this very point, but I hoped, even prayed, that he might be swayed by the larger cause." Holmes did not flinch. Pendray continued. "Colonel Woodley was misguided, but to expose him would have brought ruin upon the service. The envoy, God rest him, chose loyalty to a dead ideal. I chose to protect the living one." He sat heavily, the echo of his words ringing out across the long table. I could not help but regard him with something approaching sorrow, for though he spoke of patriotism, it was a patriotism whose highest value was secrecy, and whose first casualty was truth. Holmes remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back, and for a moment I saw in him not the detective alone, but a kind of moral sentinel, a man to whom clarity was not merely intellectual, but ethical, Sir Reginald, he began, your arguments are not without a certain cold logic, but I fear logic, when divorced from conscience, becomes nothing more than justification draped in the garb of strategy. He turned slightly toward the others. Justice, gentlemen, is not the servant of convenience, and truth, however unwelcome, is not the property of empire. To preserve the illusion of integrity at the cost of a man's life is to destroy that very integrity from within. There was no thunder in his tone, no grand flourish, yet the words struck with the finality of a gavel. Pendray did not reply. His face, drained of all colour, seemed to collapse inward upon itself. The silence in the chamber deepened, as if acknowledging that no rebuttal could now suffice. Holmes took his seat once more, but the air around him remained charged, less with indignation than with the solemn finality of something irreparably revealed. A discreet knock at the chamber's door signalled the arrival of two uniformed men, whose insignia bore no division, no unit, only the ambiguous authority of quiet removal. They approached Sir Reginald without instruction, and he rose without resistance. As he was led away, he cast neither glance nor word in Holmes's direction. I watched him disappear beyond the oak-panelled threshold, a man who had served the Empire in silence, and would now vanish into it the same way. No statement was issued, no decree read. The officials gathered their notes, though I observed that no one had written a single word, and began to rise in turn. One of them, the naval officer, paused by Holmes and offered a curt nod of acknowledgement that carried no warmth, but perhaps a modicum of respect. Holmes and I stepped back into the corridor. Behind us, the heavy door shut with a whisper, not a slam. The matter, we were told, was to be marked classified, buried, as so many things are, in the vaults of imperial discretion. The public would hear nothing. The envoy's death would remain unresolved. And yet, as we emerged once more into the London fog, I could not help but feel that Holmes had given voice to the one thing that could not be silenced. We returned to Baker Street, not as victors, but as men who had walked to the brink of truth and returned with silence as our only banner. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows against the yellowing pages of case notes and clippings that lined our sitting room. Outside, London's fog crept along the panes like a living veil, indifferent to the weight of the secrets we carried back across continents. Holmes sat in his usual chair, legs crossed, his violin resting against the arm as if awaiting a mood that had not yet come. He had not spoken since we passed the threshold, save for a brief inquiry to Mrs. Hudson regarding tea. I, meanwhile, paced the carpet in subdued agitation. My mind had not yet settled from the image of Sir Reginald Pendray's retreating figure, nor from the suffocating silence of Whitehall's verdict. "Holmes," I said at last, "is that truly the end of it?" He did not look up. "The end, Watson, is a matter often determined by those who record it, not by those who endure it." I resumed pacing, unsure whether to press further. But I knew Holmes well enough to sense that his stillness was not born of satisfaction. Something yet unsaid flickered behind those sharp grey eyes. And indeed, after a long pause, he reached into the folds of his travelling coat, withdrawing a slender, worn envelope sealed in wax that bore the crest of the British crown. He handed it to me without comment. I turned it over in my hands, its edges charred slightly, the wax seal softened but unbroken. The moment I cracked it open, the scent of damp canvas and burnt paper rose like the ghost of the train itself. Inside was a single folded sheet, written in a firm, unmistakably military hand. "To whom it may concern," it began. The confession was damning in its simplicity. Colonel Woodley admitted to corresponding with Ottoman intermediaries for over a year, selling strategic information in exchange for gold, discreetly transferred through Balkan trade networks. He expressed no remorse, only the conviction that Britain's presence in the East had grown arrogant, unsustainable, and that the seeds of decline could not be forestalled, only profited from. Pendray knew, he wrote, and so did others. But the trouble was not in what I did, but in what I threatened to expose by doing it. The document bore his signature, dated just 3 days before the train's departure. When I looked up, Holmes was studying me with that unreadable calm I had come to recognise in moments of moral gravity. "You had this all along," I murmured. "I found it during our final morning in Istanbul," he said. "Sewn into the lining of the envoy's valise. Cleverly done, but not clever enough." This could have brought the truth to light, formally, publicly. Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "Yes, and it nearly did." I frowned. "Nearly?" He nodded once. "There was one further turn, Watson, one that required payment, not in coin, but in something dearer." I recall the blood draining from my face even before he had spoken the words. You gave it away?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he rose, crossed to the fireplace, and placed another log upon the dwindling flame. His back remained turned as he spoke. "You were being held, Watson, not arrested, not accused, merely detained. And yet I knew by the glances of the guards, the tones of their voices, that the suggestion of espionage was beginning to take root. I remembered those hours vividly now, my passport taken, my name scribbled in ledgers, the curt phrases in Turkish whispered between uniformed men just beyond my hearing. I had not realised in truth how near the precipice I had stood. The letter, Holmes continued, was the only proof that could not be denied. When it became clear that your release would not be granted without condition, I gave it up." He turned now, meeting my gaze without a trace of regret. "I chose between public justice and private loyalty." My hand trembled slightly as I refolded the confession. I tried to summon words of gratitude, of protest, of some feeble attempt to restore equilibrium between us. But none came. "I had no right to be your burden in that way," I said at last. "You were never a burden, Watson," he replied, softer than I expected. "Only a companion worth more than the noise of politics." The letter lay once more on the table between us. Truth, sealed again, but now with the stamp of sacrifice. The firelight played upon Holmes's face, casting shadows that moved like passing thoughts. I sat in silence, the letter between my fingers growing heavier by the moment. In all our years of shared peril, of rifles and poisons, of fog-bound alleys and foreign sands, I had never once doubted Holmes's judgment. But now, as the crackle of embers filled the void between us, I found myself wrestling with something more complex than doubt. It was grief. Not for a man, or even a cause, but for the quiet burial of truth. "That letter," I said slowly, "could have cleared the envoy's name, could have exposed the rot." Holmes gave a faint shrug, his eyes distant. "Perhaps, or it might have stirred a hornet's nest, one whose sting would have landed on innocents far from the battlefield." I leaned forward. "So, we let it pass? Let it fade into forgotten paper?" "No," he replied. "We preserve it, just not publicly." I understood, but understanding did not ease the weight in my chest. Justice, I had learned, did not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it was traded in silence for something more fragile, like the life of a friend. Holmes reached once more for his violin, the bow resting across his knee like an unfinished sentence. He did not play. He merely held it, as one might hold a memory too delicate to disturb. "Not all truths serve best in the daylight," he said. "Some must be kept in the cupboard, not denied, not destroyed, but held in trust." I nodded slowly. So the world will not know. He gave a faint smile. The world rarely knows what saves it. Outside, the fog thickened, muffling the distant clatter of hooves and the bells of lamplighters on their rounds. Within our room, only the soft hiss of coal filled the stillness. I slipped the letter back into its envelope. Holmes's eyes did not leave the fire. "Not lost, Watson," he murmured. "Merely unspoken." The fire had sunk low, its embers glowing faintly in the heart of the hearth as Holmes sat before it, the shadows of the room stretching long and thin. The only sound in the room was the soft, almost ethereal tones of his violin, its strings trembling beneath his fingers in a mournful, haunting air. I had heard him play many times, but tonight the music seemed different, its melancholy strain reflecting the thoughts that undoubtedly plagued his mind. I sat across from him, my journal open, but my pen unmoving. The quiet of the room enveloped us both, and yet I could not shake the feeling that the weight of our case, the burden of truth and silence, hung heavier in the air than any mere notes from that violin. It was as though the very walls of 221B had absorbed the secrets we had uncovered, the lies we had untangled, and now only the music, so sweetly sorrowful, could give voice to what words could not. Holmes played with a concentration that I had not often seen, his brow furrowed slightly, his gaze distant, as if lost in some labyrinth of his own thoughts. The haunting air swirled around us like the mist outside, ever present, but never touching, never quite graspable. Finally, as the last note lingered in the air, he lowered the bow and looked across at me, his eyes sharp, though their usual intensity seemed softened by the night's quiet. He did not speak immediately, and I found myself unsure whether to break the silence or wait for him to continue. His gaze held mine for a moment longer, as if weighing something unspoken. Then, with an almost imperceptible nod, he placed the violin gently back in its case, as though concluding a conversation that had been held between the two of us through the music. Holmes's voice broke the silence, a quiet murmur that seemed almost too soft for the weight it carried. "When truth travels by train, Watson," he said, his eyes still distant, "it is too often made to switch tracks." I sat still, absorbing the metaphor. He was not merely referring to our case, but to something far deeper, something I could feel beneath the surface of his words. Truth, as we had discovered, had not arrived at its intended destination. It had been intercepted, diverted, and ultimately obscured by powers both foreign and domestic. I felt a pang of unease rise in me. The case was over, or so it seemed. Pendry, the orchestrator, had been removed, the affair buried under the veil of imperial discretion. Yet, even now, I could not rid myself of the nagging sense that something was unfinished. Something about the truth itself had been left hanging, unresolved. Holmes looked up then, catching my eye, his expression unreadable. "And you, Watson," he added, "are left with the question that I, too, must ask. What remains when truth is derailed?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered, and I found myself lost in thought, the music still echoing faintly in my mind. As I sat by the fire, the weight of Holmes's words hung in the air like the smoke curling upward from the dying embers. The case had come to an end, yet in my mind, it felt as though justice had not been served so much as postponed. I glanced down at my journal, the pages open but empty, the ink still fresh and unused. I had chronicled every detail, every deduction Holmes had made, but as the final chords of the case played out, I found myself questioning whether I should write it all down. Would it be right to record such a tale? A tale where the truth was buried not by the hands of the guilty, but by those sworn to protect the empire itself? Was it justice when it was hidden behind closed doors, sealed with silence and consent? I paused, my pen hovering over the paper, uncertain. My mind wandered to the envoy, whose death had been deemed acceptable to maintain the peace, to the truth we had unearthed, and the price paid to silence it. What justice could be found in that? Holmes, I asked, my voice quieter than I intended, do you think justice was ever truly served in this case? He did not answer immediately, but I felt his gaze on me, piercing and thoughtful. Holmes sat motionless, his back to me as he stared into the fire. His reply, when it came, was quiet but firm. We cannot always preserve both honor and empire, my dear Watson, but we must try. The words hung in the air, heavy with their meaning. I had expected a more definitive answer, some final resolution, but instead, I was left with a reflection. The truth, after all, was not so easily moulded into something that could be neatly catalogued and published. It was tangled, complex, and often, as Holmes had shown, obscured by the machinations of those in power. I set down my pen, and for a long while, neither of us spoke. The fire crackled softly, its warmth fading as the night wore on. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the world in its silencing embrace. I realized then, as Holmes's words echoed in my mind, that perhaps some things, some truths, were meant to remain unspoken. With that, the case of the missing train, the diplomat's death, and the political conspiracy faded into the quiet halls of Baker Street, sealed not with official closure, but with an understanding between Holmes and me. A truth we would carry with us, forever untouched by the public eye. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the shadows lengthened in the room, Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers still resting on the violin's neck. His eyes, however, were far away, lost in the quiet reflections of a case that, though concluded, had not yielded the answers we so desired. You see, Watson, he said softly, truth is often like a train, intended to move in a single direction, but derailed by the forces of power and secrecy. It is only when the wheels stop turning that we discover the cost of its diversion. The weight of his words settled in the silence between us, and I could not help but wonder, was it the actions of the guilty that truly caused the most harm, or the silence of those in power who allowed the truth to die? What do you think was the greatest mistake in this case? Was it Pendry's cover-up, or the darker forces at play behind the scenes? I would be interested to hear your thoughts. Please leave your comments below, share this mystery with your friends, and subscribe for more tales from the world of Sherlock Holmes. The mystery, as always, is far from over.